Yep.
Okay, let's just see if I can share some slides. Bear with me one moment. Voila. Can everyone see that?
Well, yep, we can see it here.
Brilliant. Good stuff. Okay. Right. So, as you know, tonight I'm going to talk to you about the relationship between church, state, and the monarchy. Not something that's been a particularly salient issue at the best of times, but it has risen up the agenda of late due to a few factors. We had the death of Queen Elizabeth, the upcoming coronation, the latest census findings, and the Church of England's ongoing refusal to marry same-sex couples. But I think it's fair to say that few regard this as the most pressing issue in British politics or society, which is perhaps fair enough. But it is, as the former Bishop of London, Lord Charters, recently said, a debate that won't go away. I think he would rather like it to go away, but it won't go away because it is a key constitutional issue of our time. And I think we should all be a lot more interested in it. The fact that we still have a national church in our largely now secular nation is a real bizarre absurdity at the very heart of our constitution. I think it's harmful to British identity. I think it's an anomaly, bit of a nonsense that really needs to be addressed sooner or later, hopefully sooner. So as I'm sure you're all aware, the National Secular Society advocates for disestablishment, so separation between church, state and the monarch. And we'll get on to why we think that's the most sensible approach in terms to take in terms of church-state relations in due course. But to begin, if you don't mind, I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at what establishment is and what it entails in a UK context. So in broad terms, disestablishment or establishment, sorry, means a kind of formal relationship between a church or a religion and the state in which it operates. Now, the United Kingdom is made up of 4 countries, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The Church of England is established in only one of these countries, England. There's no established churches in Northern Ireland or Wales. The Church of Ireland was disestablished in 1871. Disestablishment took place in Wales in 1920. The Church of Scotland has a special status in Scotland, but it isn't established in the same way. It's wholly independent. Now, probably the most visible manifestation of Anglican establishment is the reigning monarch being simultaneously head of state as well as the head of the church, holding the titles of Supreme Governor of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. And for the avoidance of doubt, that faith is the one true Protestant faith. Now, these titles date back to the reign of King Henry VIII and the break from Rome, and there is actually a lawful requirement for the monarch to be in communion with the Church of England. This means that our head of state really has to be a Protestant. The coronation of King Charles is coming up quite soon, taking place on May the 6th, and the late monarch's coronation, the coronation ceremony of Queen Elizabeth, took place on the 2nd of June 1953, and it included the oath that you can see on the screen there. So the Archbishop of Canterbury asked the Queen whether she would maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel, maintain the Protestant religion, maintain and preserve the settlement of the Church of England and its doctrine and its worship, and preserve the rights and privileges of bishops. The Queen said, all of this I promise to do, and indeed she did. And all of this overlapping of church and head of state really entrenches religious privilege in the UK, and it gives the monarchy a kind of quasi-religious character. It's an institution that I think we're almost encouraged to worship, and I think that's a bit problematic, because if the monarch's authority is derived from God, then it's not entirely clear how the monarchy can be held accountable for their actions by any earthly or secular authority, such as Parliament or the people. Now, the next coronation will be taking place, as I say, on the 6th of May, and it will, in all likelihood, look and feel very similar to the previous one. There may be a nod to multi-faithism, but it will be an unmistakably Anglican affair. because there's not really any scope for it to be anything but. The coronation ceremony, the crowning of our head of state, is primarily a religious ceremony. It's a religious service. The service includes oaths, as I've just set out, to defend religious privilege. The sovereign is then anointed, blessed, and consecrated by the archbishop, and then Holy Communion is celebrated. Now, the thing is, we don't actually need a coronation. It's wholly unnecessary. No other European monarch has one. Clearly, taking the oath isn't a prerequisite for the accession of the crown. Coronations do not make a monarch. King Charles is already king, of course. And as the coronation is, as human rights barrister Geoffrey Robertson, KC, recently said, a legal irrelevance, just a silly and superstitious Church of England ritual. Charles has no need at all to be crowned by a minority church. Quite an expensive irrelevance too. We have freedom of information, lodged freedom of information request to find out how much the coronation is costing, how much has been budgeted, but they're refusing to give that information away just yet. Now, if it was felt that some sort of ceremony was necessary, a secular crowning ceremony could take place in Westminster Hall, perhaps instead of Westminster Abbey. We could remove the religious oath from the coronation by reforming the Coronation Oaths Act of 1688. I think any law dating back to 1688 could probably use a look at. The oath has been amended a little bit over the years. For example, in the 20th century, references to the Irish Church were removed, just to recognise that the Church of Ireland had been disestablished. But it could be argued that our monarchy can never really be truly secular, because without the claim of by the grace of God, if they don't have this divine right to rule, then where on earth does their legitimacy come from? So secularising the monarchy isn't a can of worms that monarchists, conservatives, or the royals themselves will be keen to open up. It's certainly true that monarchy and religion are deeply interwoven. Whether the institution of monarchy should continue at all is another question, probably beyond the secularist remit to some extent. But there's certainly a debate to be had, and the accession of King Charles certainly provides an opportunity for us to press the message for secular reforms, and we are trying to get that debate started. This is a piece I wrote for The Independent recently, not arguing for abolition of the monarchy. That's, as I say, not really within our remit. But if we are to have a head of state, then our line is that that role should be secular, and disestablishment should deliver that. So that's one pillar of establishment. Another manifestation of church establishment is the bishop's bench. Now, we're the only parliament in Europe to have explicit religious representation. I think actually the Isle of Man does too. But it's just us. Outside of Europe, only Iran has explicit religious representation in a similar way. There's always at least one Lord Spiritual in the House of Lords when it's sitting to read prayers at the start of the day, but there are often several in there, especially when they have a particular interest in what's being debated. The official proceedings of the House can't actually begin until prayers have been read. The same goes for the House of Commons too, by the way, where prayers are led there by the Speaker's chaplain. Like other members, bishops can take part in all the business of the House, including tabling and asking questions of ministers, leading or speaking in debates, scrutinising legislation, voting, serving on committees or all-party parliamentary groups. So the privilege of seats in the Lords extends far beyond just the right to vote. It gives Church of England bishops really unique access to ministers, lawmakers, and the corridors of power, influence far beyond that any other religious or secular special interest group, such as ourselves, can dream of. Now, another aspect of the church's relation of establishment is the church's relationship to Parliament. Now, many of the laws passed by the General Synod also have to be approved by both houses of Parliament before they can come into effect. So this means that although the governance of the Church of England and its members has been delegated to the General Synod, Parliament still remains legislatively supreme. So in many ways, the Church is actually subservient to Parliament. In fact, Parliament has the authority to pass laws affecting the Church without the church's involvement. But by convention, it tends not to do that, but it does have the power to do so. Another connection between the church and the state is the church commissioners. This is the body which administers the considerable property assets of the Church of England, and their job is to produce revenue to support the church's ministry. So they manage a 10.1 billion investment fund as things stand. Now, incredibly, 6 of the 33 commissioners hold offices of state. So these are ex officio commissioners, Church of England commissioners. They're the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, the Lord President of the Council, Penny Mordaunt, the Secretary of State for Justice, Dominic Raab, the Secretary of State for Digital Media, Culture, Media and Sport, Michelle Donnellan, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, and the Lord Speaker, John McFall. So these people have responsibility for managing the Church of England's investments and property portfolio. The King also appoints a senior Anglican backbench MP from the governing party as what's called the Second Church Estates Commissioner. So the current Second Church Estate Commissioner is this guy, Andrew Sellis, MP. So his role is really to speak officially on behalf of the Church of England in Parliament, and he makes sure that the established church is held accountable to Parliament by answering questions. So a recent example was a question from Ben Bradshaw, the Labour MP for Exeter, who called on Andrew Sellis and the church to explain how continuing to discriminate against lesbian and gay Anglicans in England is compatible with the unique duty of the established church to serve everyone. Now, naturally, Andrew Sellis couldn't really provide a satisfactory response to that question. And this is a real issue because as the established church, it really is required to minister to the whole of the English population. So this involves a legal duty to marry, bury and baptize all of those who reside within the parish. Of course, this became an issue when same-sex marriage was legislated for. The church sought and were granted amendments to ensure that the duty to marry parishioners didn't extend to same-sex couples. So as a result, the UK law now actually prevents Church of England clergy from carrying out same-sex marriage. That would change if the church changes its position, but it recently indicated that it will not do that. Ben Bradshaw just today actually has tabled a bill to permit the Church of England to marry same-sex couples. So that's just permissive legislation. It wouldn't force them to do it. It would just allow clergy that want to marry same-sex couples to do so, because unlike any other religion at the moment, that can carry out same-sex marriages, the Church of England legally can't. So in addition to the Second Church Estates Commissioner, there's also the Speaker's Chaplain. I think I've got a slide of her. Yep, there she is. This is the Reverend Canon Patricia Hillis. So the chaplain is there to read prayers in the House of Commons chamber before every sitting, only after which the formal business can begin. She also presides at the weekly service of Holy Communion that's celebrated in Parliament's very own chapel, St Mary Undercroft, it's called. But the influence over the state, over the church, also extends to the filling of key positions within the church. So here's a recent government press release announcing that a Church of England bishop is to be appointed, the Bishop of Blackburn, I think it is in this case. And this is the bishop, by the way, who refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of female bishops. So this is the government that makes this appointment. So bishops and archbishops are appointed by the ruling monarch, acting on advice from the Prime Minister. So until the mid-1970s, the Prime Minister had an unfettered right to advise on the appointment. And the church actually had no formal role in the appointing process of its own bishops or archbishops at all, although it was usually consulted as a matter of courtesy. Now, in 1976, the church was given a more prominent role in the appointment of bishops. So from then on, a short list of 2 was given to the Prime Minister, a first and a second preference. Now, on 3 occasions, Margaret Thatcher overrode the wishes of the church and appointed the name that was second on the preferences of the Church of England rather than its first choice. But in 1997, it was actually reported that Tony Blair rejected both of the candidates put forward by the church to succeed the Bishop of Liverpool. Of course, this became a bit of a problem when the PM, this becomes a bit of a problem when the PM isn't an Anglican. I think at the time when Tony Blair was advising, he hadn't actually converted to Catholicism. But under the law, no person professing the Roman Catholic religion is allowed to advise the Queen on the selection of Church of England bishops. So obviously that left a nominally Catholic former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in a bit of a tricky situation. So instead, the Lord Chancellor, Robert Buckland, had to be drafted in to play that advisory role on the bishops. So again, our settlement sort of assumes that our political leaders will be Anglican. Bizarrely, Rishi Sunak, who's a Hindu, can advise the king on the selection of Church of England bishops. Only Catholics are prohibited. So I suspect a Hindu prime minister was never really envisaged. Anyway, appointments to other church positions such as deans, deacons and priests, they're also shaped by the views of state officials. So there's plenty of church meddling going on in state affairs, but there's also plenty of state meddling going on in church affairs, which as a secularist, I wouldn't support. I think the Church of England, like all other religions, should enjoy complete independence. Now, perhaps another aspect of establishment is the continued role that the church plays in state education. So faith schools aren't directly linked to establishment. The church could continue to act as an education provider, even if it were disestablished. But certainly the role that the church and now other faith groups as well play in state education is, I think, very much down in part to the privileged role that the church has enjoyed in our political settlement and our society more broadly. So a quarter of all primary schools are run by the Church of England, which give the church a real significant say and influence in education policy. I think it's the reason that we still have a law requiring a daily act of collective worship in schools, why we have an exemption from equality law that allows church schools to discriminate in their admissions in favour of churchgoers. And we also have quite an outdated model of religious education that allows special interest groups, particularly faith groups, to determine the syllabus, which of course has to reflect the broadly Christian nature of the country. And I think the presence of the established church is really a significant barrier to achieving a truly secular education system that's free from religious discrimination or control. And due to its established status, the church also has a prominent ceremonial role in our state occasions. The church has a very dominant role in our National Service of Remembrance, which is why the annual ceremony at the Cenotaph sometimes does resemble a church service, with the Bishop of London leading Christian prayers. But if remembrance is important, and I think it is, then I think it needs to be meaningful to people. And if it's not meaningful, then people will switch off, particularly younger people. And if people switch off, then they forget. So given that religion is clearly a turn-off for so many British people, particularly younger people, I think our national remembrance, having this religious flavour, is far from ideal. And then there is, of course, another state occasion, the coronation, which I covered earlier. It'll be interesting to see the reaction to the forthcoming coronation, which, as I said, will be a deeply religious affair, because the nation's religion and belief landscape has changed out of all recognition since the last coronation in 1953. So it'll be interesting to see how the public react. So how did disestablishment come about? Well, it was, of course, the refusal of the Pope to annul the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon that led to Henry VIII abolishing papal authority in 1534 and taking on the role of supreme head of the Church of England. So, as Geoffrey Robertson, again, KC, pointed out in one of our Bradlaugh lectures on this topic, our current constitutional arrangement, it wasn't the result of any moral or intellectual movement. It's not a source of national pride, but a somewhat grubby affair. Essentially, the Church of England was established by the lust of a pathological monster. That was how Henry VIII was described by the Tudor historian Tracy Borman when she was discussing Anne Boleyn's execution at the Tower of London. Apparently, Henry first wanted her burnt at the stake, but in the end, out of pity, he settled for a simple beheading. But that's how it all began. That's the man responsible and the circumstances that led to our current constitutional settlement. It all dates back from an era in which church and state were virtually indistinguishable. But the nature of establishment has changed over the years. On the screen there, you've got various reforms that took place in the 19th century. So establishment used to entail financial support for the church from the state. However, not since the first half of the 19th century has the Church of England received any grant that's not, in theory at least, equally available to other denominations. In practice, the Church of England receives large amounts of public money for the maintenance of its buildings, some of which may be justified in terms of preserving our national heritage. But we've worked out at the NSS that the Church of England receives several £150 million of public money in the last 5 years through various means. And don't forget, this is a church that sits on assets worth more than 22 billion. Okay, so whether the state should be spending 750 million on an organization that has 22 billion in the bank, well, that's I'll leave you to answer that. But two forms of taxation which used to benefit the Church of England no longer exist. The church tax for the maintenance of church fabric and worship was abolished on a compulsory basis, at least in 1868, while the tithe was phased out from 1936. But aside from the public money that is funneled into church schools, there is now no direct public funding for the Church of England. Nevertheless, the close relationship between church and state is definitely a key feature of our current constitutional settlement. So, why do I think we should change that? So what is the case for disestablishment? Well, I think there are two principal objections. First, it's unfair. The existence of a legally enshrined national religion and an established church privileges one part of the population, one institution, and one set of beliefs. Is it really appropriate for there to be seats reserved in the House of Lords for Church of England bishops only? Is it appropriate for the UK Prime Minister to have a weekly meeting with the Supreme Governor of the Church of England to discuss government matters? It really isn't. It really isn't. So removing the symbolic and the institutional ties between the government, the monarchy, and religion would, I think, go a long way to ensuring equal treatment and parity of citizenship for people of all faiths and none. But it is the case, and we probably need to acknowledge this, that Anglican establishment does actually enjoy some support from other religions, well, at least from religious leaders. So why is that? Well, King Charles has made clear his intention to be the defender of faith generally, not only the faith. In fact, he will be defender of the faith, but he has made clear that he wants to protect faith generally. And this fits with the role that the Church of England has sort of assumed for itself as representing of other faiths as a means by which other denominations and other faith communities can be privileged or elevated in public life. It's unclear to what extent individual members of other faiths are content to ride on the coattails of Anglican establishment, or to what extent some Anglicans want the Church of England to actually promote what are mutually exclusive faiths in many cases. But many faith leaders do enjoy enhanced status granted by the Church of England, holding the door open for them. So humanists are sometimes invited to the multi-faith table, sometimes secularists too, but ultimately the favouritism shown to the Church of England with crumbs from the table for other religious groups, I think it demeans minority faiths. I don't think they should be spoken for by the church. I think this sort of multi-faithism mostly neglects and disenfranchises the non-religious and the religiously unconcerned, who actually form the majority of the country now. Multi-faithism really doesn't give those people a voice. It is true that the late Queen Elizabeth and King Charles have been advocates for religious freedom, or what should more accurately be called freedom of religion or belief, which is something that I very much support too. But I support it for everyone, not just for some. But it's not clear how the monarch's support for freedom of religion or belief is in any way consistent with the fact that the role of head of state in this country is reserved exclusively for practicing Christians. That seems to go against the principles of freedom of religion or belief. the monarchy's religious role is really underpinned by an assumption that all future monarchs will be believing Anglicans, and the constitution actually prevents Catholics from becoming the monarch. So as I say, this all runs contrary to the concepts of fairness and freedom or religion or belief. But not only does our current constitutional setup make second-class citizens out of non-Anglicans, it also makes second-class citizens out of lesbian and gay people. So the Archbishop of Canterbury recently reaffirmed his church's official rejection of gay sex and same-sex marriage. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the church's doctrine is its own affair. But as we've been pointed out in this recent ad campaign, surely an officially homophobic institution shouldn't be part of the state. And Justin Welby's attempt to hold disagreeing factions of the Anglican communion together, I think, have really worrying implications for the state church. So not a lot of people know this, but the Church of England's General Synod last year voted to give overseas Anglican leaders greater power in choosing future archbishops of Canterbury. So this will give greater weight to the views of the more orthodox Anglican bishops who reject gay sex and same-sex marriage as incompatible with Scripture. So to save the Anglican communion, to keep it together, I think the Church of England is likely to become more religiously conservative, which will only further alienate itself from the country it supposedly serves. And also it is causing deep divisions within the Church of England here too. So all of this, I think, only reinforces the need for disestablishment and a rethink of the privileged role that the church plays in the public and political life of the country. And as the Labour MP, Ben Bradshaw, said recently, the overwhelming view of MPs on both sides of the House is that it's not sustainable for an established church to be institutionally homophobic and to actively exclude a portion of the population who they have a duty to serve. So the second argument that I have against us having an established church is simply that it's not authentic. It's no good pretending that this is still a Christian country. Christianity is one major influence among many that shape our current ways of life, but we can't, not in any meaningful way, be described as a Christian country anymore. The concept of a national church is really at odds with the diverse and pluralistic nature of the UK. The number of people who describe themselves as belonging to the Church of England is at a record low. Just look at the data and you can see that Church of England establishment has really become an absurd anachronism. So what you're looking at there on the screen is the most recent census data. And this showed that the percentage of Christian adherents in England and Wales has fallen from 72% in 2001 to 59% in 2011, and now to 46% in 2021. That's going down 13% every 10 years. And if it continues to fall at that rate, it's going to be a very small percentage by 2050. But already it's the case that Christians are in a minority situation. And lots of other polling in recent years paints a picture of declining religiosity and growing non-religiosity. So a British social attitudes survey found that about half the population of this country have no religion, including 7 out of 10 of those aged 18 to 24. Just 12% of Brits are affiliated to the C of E. Normal Sunday Church of England attendance represents just 0.9% of the English population. That's some way short of the 46% of Christians in the census, and just 1% of young adults identify with the Church of England. But it's not just affiliation, it's attitudes too. 60% of Brits don't think religion is important in their lives. 81% agree that religious practice is a private matter and should be separated from the political and economic life of the country. More of us oppose than support the idea of the UK having an official state religion. 58% of the population oppose faith schools, and British citizens, including churchgoers, overwhelmingly reject the church's stance on abortion, on assisted dying, and on same-sex marriage. So establishment really doesn't sit well with reality. It's out of date, it's past its sell-by date. And for me, I think these things matter. I think we need a strong national identity that people can buy into. And I think it's vital that we do everything we can to integrate and achieve social cohesion. So I think we need a stronger sense of who we are, a stronger sense of shared citizenship. And that needs to be based around universal values. And I think becoming a secular state will help us to start to build a more inclusive and positive national identity rather than this vaguely Christian identity that we currently have, that in truth, not many of us buy into. Some of us can't buy into it. And so I don't think it's particularly inclusive. Just take our national anthem, for example. God Save the King isn't something that many people in this country can sing with any real authenticity. The existence of an established church also, internationally speaking, is a bit of an anomaly. According to one study, just 25% of countries around the world have a state religion. That's 48 countries out of 192. And just 18 of these, 37%, were classed as liberal democracies. So we are an anomaly, not necessarily a bad thing, but we do need to recognize that what we do in this country is not particularly normal. Now, a third objection comes actually not from me, but from within the established church itself. There are arguments for disestablishment increasingly coming from Anglicans and from a broader Christian perspective too. So in his book, Beyond Establishment, the Anglican Jonathan Chaplin argues that the Church of England should voluntarily relinquish its privileges and establish status to free the church to pursue its own mission with greater authenticity. And it's an argument that we're increasingly hearing from Anglicans who actually value autonomy and recognize the importance of state impartiality. A former Anglican vicar, Colin Buchanan, also wrote a book called Cut the Connection. And in there, he argues that disestablishment is the overriding policy the Church of England ought to pursue in relation to the state today. And then there's Martin Percy, a respected British academic, theologian, and Church of England priest, former Church of England priest, actually, who wrote a piece for Prospect magazine recently, arguing that the church should surrender its seats in the House of Lords and stop trying to cling to the privilege and power of the past. Earlier this year, Percy announced he was leaving the Church of England because of his concerns over its management of safeguarding as well as bullying and harassment within the church, of which he was a victim. And then from a broader Christian perspective, he's not an Anglican, but we have Tim Farron, the former Lib Dem leader, one of the most evangelical Christians in Parliament today. He told Robert Peston, I have always been someone who believes very strongly in a secular society. I believe very much that the church should be disestablished. And here, writing in the Times, this is back from 1989, the religious commentator Clifford Longley said, any church which still needs official state privilege for support has chosen to manacle itself to a spiritual corpse. In their hearts, everybody knows it, but no one will admit it. Justin Welby has himself said that disestablishment wouldn't be a disaster for the church, but he made it clear that he wouldn't be initiating change. So for the time being, the church still appears to willing to unshackle itself from the spiritual corpse that Clifford Longley spoke of. Those who benefit from religious establishment will, I suppose, instinctively cling to it, not least the bishops, whose seats in the House of Lords give them considerable political lobbying power and prestige, which they quite enjoy. But bishops aside, I think it is clear that many Christians would actually now support disestablishment. And I say this only to point out that disestablishment need not be this big clash between church and state. Many within the church think disestablishment may actually be the best strategy for survival in an increasingly secular society. So it could perhaps be progressed with the mutual understanding that a formal separation stands to benefit both. I think all sides should be able to recognise that maintaining a minority established church in what is now a religiously pluralistic and largely secularised nation is completely unsustainable. So for all the reasons that I've mentioned this evening. I will finish in a minute. For all the reasons I've mentioned this evening, I think we need to get on with this establishment. At the same time, I don't underestimate the challenge. For some people, there will always be more pressing matters. There's never really been great appetite for addressing constitutional issues in this country until Brexit, perhaps. But this is something that really needs to happen sooner or later. I think concepts of nationhood and citizenship, I think they're too important to centre around an anachronism. And church establishment, this idea of us being a Christian country, really is an anachronism. And the UK's drift away from Christianity looks set to continue. All the trends, declining Christian belief, and ageing Anglican congregation means Christianity will, without doubt, continue to decline. And at the same time, we've got non-religiosity and minority faiths, and particularly Islam, seeing real significant growth. So I think we do need a long-term sustainable settlement on the relationship between religion and state. And I think that should, of course, be a secular state where everyone's free to practice their faith, but not to impose it. So any future settlement should be based on the principles of secularism. And that means a clear separation between religion and state and equality for all, irrespective of religion or belief. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Stephen.
Yes.
I'll stop the recording at that point so we can change the view.